Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this special webinar, a webinar that will no doubt continue to drive us into ensuring that we are addressing social protection issues which continue to affect us. I'm Janet Bogwa. Allow me to give a small introduction as to why we're here today, a little bit about who we'll expect to have in this session, and we will also give you some housekeeping. So allow me to do that. This webinar is really about how contextualizing Africa faces persistent challenges in ensuring social protection for its migrants and displaced populations. Barriers like inadequate frameworks, access, and funding gaps make it difficult to provide essential services. And so what we're hoping to do is to explore issues with our esteemed panel of experts. I'll be introducing them a little later on in this webinar to discuss how to overcome some of these barriers, build inclusive frameworks, and address funding and political resistance. We will also have a question and answer after the panel, but again, I am going to come to that very shortly. I'd like to walk you through some of the hospitality rules and regulations that we have, just to make sure we have a very smooth webinar. Audio, video. All participants, except the moderator and panelists, will remain muted with video off to reduce distractions. Chat use. Please use the chat for technical issues or general comments. For your question and answer, you can direct those to the Q&A feature. There's a button that will guide you on where to leave your questions for our panelists following the panel conversation, or even during the conversation. You can begin to leave your questions. We'll be able to come back to those towards the end of this session. Timekeeping sessions will really adhere to the time. So keep your questions and comments concise so that we can also make sure your questions are answered adequately. For any technical support, please contact the tech team in the chat if needed. And again, we do encourage the use of hashtags, right? So one of the hashtags is hashtag social protection, hashtag migration, hashtag social impact, and hashtag funding impact. This is important. If you're going to share this conversation across platforms, whether it's on LinkedIn or your X, you can keep people updated on what the conversation is saying, and we can continue to follow those hashtags to get more information on what's expected to come out of this. And so we are going to be introducing somebody first who is going to set the tone for us. He is the Global Director, CHASP Advisory. His name is Omondi Otieno. Allow me to give you one or two words about him before he comes on screen and gives us the welcome remarks. He's responsible for leading CHASP Advisory's global strategy and dedicates his time to industry innovation and establishing new business lines under the CHASP Advisory Group. So he is going to be giving us his welcome remarks for the session today and setting the tone for a conversation that is truly meant to challenge us all to do more. Mr. Omondi, the floor is yours.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much, Janet. It's truly appreciated. And most certainly, I'd like to thank everyone who has taken time to join. And of course, all the panelists and the tech team for the hard work that we have all put in ahead of this webinar. A couple of things I'd like to point to. Number one is that we are exploring the possibility of this being the first in a series of webinars. Of course, that would be of interest in subjects that are relevant to the work that we do at CHASP, and I'm about to speak to that shortly, but also the work that Instiglio does, because then that would build in very many ways the partnership that we have with Instiglio. So that's number one. Number two is basically just then take up about 2-3 minutes. I'm talking about CHASP and what CHASP does. So CHASP, which then stands for Capacities for Health and Social Policy, is a think tank for social development and global health. Within CHASP, we have two divisions, so the division of global health and the division of social policy. But then it is fair to say that social policy is far more developed. And of course, we still are in the process of ensuring that, our work on global health, progressively grows over time. With in terms of focusing on the specifics of what we do, a couple of things. Number one is to then promote development of humanitarian learning. This webinar particularly aligns to that. So it is the understanding that the development sector, the humanitarian sector, are sectors that require continuous learning. It is the understanding that in the process of governments and development partners implementing development and humanitarian programs, a lot of data is generated. And there are certain shifts in context from which we collectively need to learn. So we have at CHASP the responsibility of organizing, of taking advantage of the evidence generated and the lessons that are drawn from implementation to be able to influence learning. And we hope that we will continue to provide a lot more platforms beyond this webinar for learning to take place. So that's number one. So the second thing we do at CHASP is in terms of system strengthening. So we realize that the delivery of social assistance, the delivery of social protection, or delivery of global health programs require certain systems to be in place. And this could be mostly from a social protection perspective. This could be systems of targeting. This could be systems for payment. This could be systems for management of information. This could be systems for feedback and case management. And we have a responsibility to do that. Over time, we have worked with different partners to, for example, build social single registries. We have worked with different partners for targeting, for social assistance programs, and we will continue. We will continue to do that in the times to come. Of course, one of the things that we have continuously done is to organize landings. Again, from our work around systems, and those are certainly available on our website. Should anyone take a moment to check those out. Policy, which is our third work stream. Policy work again is very, very critical. The ability for us to ensure that there are systems. There are frameworks at a national and especially in the case of Kenya, subnational level, to be able to grow or improve the delivery of social protection systems. Again, development work in the manner that is perpetuated by a lot of development partners and a lot of side actors like CHASP needs to be understood in the context of government. What that means is that governments have the primary responsibility to deliver development in whatever form. So whenever actors like CHASP come in, what we do really in an ideal sense is to either implement or pilot models that the government can potentially pick up, or strengthen the capacities of government to deliver on various development and humanitarian programs. But most importantly, contribute to the transfer of knowledge, to government officers or government structures to be able to, like I said, do exactly what they're supposed to. That can only exist within a space where there is clarity of policy and where there is clarity of processes and institutional arrangements that allow for social protection work, or in this case, even humanitarian work, to be delivered effectively. And so we contribute at CHASP at CHASP to improvements in those policies. We have, in the region, in the Eastern Horn of Africa region, contributed significantly to improvements in policy, in policies on social protection. We, for example, contributed to the development of the national social protection, policy for Kenya, which is a big achievement. Kenya is by far one of the most progressive countries, in Africa in terms of social protection, and that we are happy that we led, of course, working with government and many other partners, that piece of work. We have, say, for example, supported Rwanda in the review of their national social protection strategy. Again, this is high level policy work. We have, supported trainings, nationwide trainings on the Somali social protection policy for the government, for government officials in Somalia. So again, in Somalia. So again, some very, very notable, very, very high level engagements at that level. The fourth work streams is about community level engagement. So even as we work, as we have these macro and meso level engagements, micro level engagements are equally as important. And that is how then we also involve in direct implementation of some of these programs. So engaging communities in fragile environments to design effective resilience mechanisms basically require that we downstream engagement, require that we work with communities to be able to deliver on both short-term and long-term solutions to disruptions of income, or in processes that then progressively reduce the effect of or the impact of poverty. The fifth work stream is in terms of accelerating innovations. Of course, it's modern day. We have to definitely leverage on technology as in every other sector. We also are keen to contribute to the range of practices and to the range of knowledge available on the utilization of technology for the furtherance of social protection. So this explains why we have had engagement in the development of MISs, which are then tools that improve the delivery, the quality and delivery of social protection programs. So in very, very many, in particular ways, we have contributed to the development of, and which are then tools that improve the delivery, the quality and delivery of social protection programs. So in very, very many, in particular ways, we have contributed to the development of an MIS for ultra poor graduation. So for those who have knowledge, who are familiar with the social protection sector, then definitely you have knowledge of graduation programs and the absence of elaborate data management systems around that. Of course, having that still remains work in progress, but nonetheless, work that we are extremely, extremely proud of. And of course, we also have developed the first ever MIS for on-demand registration, which is again a big achievement. Targeting can be very, very complex, can be very, very expensive processes, especially if they're approached in a traditional sense. Traditional sense here meaning that normally there are huge resources allocated to mass identification of beneficiaries whenever programs, cash transfer programs are recruiting. The ability for us then to have an MIS that allow for beneficiaries to register continuously as they become eligible into these programs is definitely a game changer. And we are happy to have contributed and to have led the process of developing the ODR MIS for Kenya. Finally, it's basically our role in providing technical assistance. It is the understanding really that organizations, development partners, governments, NGOs design and deliver social protection programs, and CHASP is at hand, like I said, as a think tank, to be able to provide the technical assistance, highest level possible, technical assistance required to deliver some of these programs. And this could be in various areas, could be on monitoring and evaluation, could be on formative research, it could be on design elements for specific or comprehensive social assistance programs. Those are pieces of work that we're very, very passionate about. So as a whole, that then wraps up what we do at CHASP, and we hope then it's very well aligns to the conversion that we're about to have. And of course, the refugee programming is becoming an increasing need, is becoming an ever essential conversation to have. National policies, for example, in Kenya and Uganda, progressively becoming very inclusive, which then creates the need to spiral and in equal sense consider refugees as part of the fabric of social protection, literally in every country. So this conversion definitely, sits in very well with the overall agenda of what we do, and we are happy to have many more conversions of this nature. Back to you, Janet.
Allow me now to introduce who our panelists are for today's conversation. I'm going to tell you their name, their title, a little bit more about what they do, and then we will be able to begin the conversation and allow you all to ask questions. So Ezine Anyanwu is the Africa Refugee and Migration Portfolio Lead and Head Office of Instiglio, Nairobi. A little bit more about Ezine. She's a results-based management expert with over 12 years of experience in innovative financing, public sector reform, monitoring, evaluation, research and learning, digital development, and program management. So that's going to be our first panelist, and very soon we're going to be sending some questions her way. Next, we have Andrew Agumba. He's the Assistant Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Officer for UNHCR Kenya. A little bit about Andrew. He's a development professional with a robust background in livelihoods, economic inclusion, and social protection, and currently serving as the Livelihoods, Economic Inclusion, and Social Protection Lead at UNHCR Kenya. So thank you for that. Next, we have Jane Muyanga. Jane Muyanga is Director, Social Protection Secretariat, State Department of Social Protection and Senior Citizens Affairs. Jane holds a master's degree in project planning and management and currently serves as the director of the National Social Protection Secretariat, or NSPS, State Department of Social Protection and Senior Citizens Affairs in Kenya. And then finally, we have Shana Hola. Now, Shana is a technical project specialist, social health protection and forced displacement, International Labour Organization, Nairobi, Kenya. Shana currently works as a technical officer for social health protection for refugees and host communities for ILO and UNHCR for the Prospects Project based here in Nairobi. I'd now like to welcome all our panelists to even switch on their screens just so that we can get a sense of who they are, what they look like, and welcome them very warmly to this conversation. There they are. Thank you so much for being with us today, all of you. And we are going to jump right into the conversation, and I'll be making reference to some notes that I have in front of me for all of you who are joining us today. And first, I'll set the context, right? So I'll ask this question and everyone can just kind of go around and give an answer. But if each of you could briefly describe the current landscape of social protection for refugees and immigrants in Africa as you see it, and what are the most pressing needs and gaps that you observe? And so perhaps we will begin with Ezine to just paint a picture for us as we go around and ask the second question to each of our panelists. So Ezine, if you could just paint that picture for us, describing the current landscape of social protection and what you see as the most pressing gaps. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. I'm very delighted to be here this morning. So I think that the social protection landscape in Africa for refugees and migrants has been quite a mix of both progressive, steps and still some things that, some gaps that exist that we need to address. So from a policy framework, for instance, I mean, we all know Africa is hosting close to 30% of the world refugee populations, particularly countries in Uganda, for instance, and Ethiopia, hosting really high levels of refugee populations. And when it comes to social protection, these countries have demonstrated remarkable progress. So the Uganda Refugee Act, for instance, gives refugees the rights to work, the right to social services, the right to sort of move around, very progressive, really quite, in the global scale, in the global setting. Similar for Ethiopia as well, where with the revised proclamation, Ethiopia is also trying to give more access to social services and social protection to refugees. And so across the continent for these particular countries that are the main refugee hosting entities, we have seen a genuine effort, right, that these countries are demonstrating in policy, in trying to, mainstream some refugees into the national protection and social protection policies, trying as much as possible to also have services available. But then one thing we also see that is quite prevalent in the African landscape for protection for refugees also is we have cash transfers, humanitarian aid that is typically driven by, partners, donors, and development partners. And that sometimes tends to happen, in a way parallel to what the government is doing. we also see challenges around, data gaps. It's sort of, sometimes you begin to really understand, are governments able to see holistically how much of services are being offered to both refugees and nationals when it comes to social protection? Can they have very clear integrated policy data to make planning decisions, to target the right people, to make sure that resources are being well used? And of course, there is, of course, the elephant in the room of the funding. It's one thing to have a progressive framework, it's one thing to be willing to be able to do that, but we see very much in the landscape that countries still face huge resource constraints. I think I was reading something recently by the ILO around financing gaps, and it says that when it comes to like Africa, for instance, you find that low-income countries and LMICs, basically the ones that host refugees, need to raise about 1.4 trillion to be able to meet the financing gap. And so you find that, generally in Africa, while you have progress, countries trying to mainstream policies, trying to really be welcoming, trying to ensure that refugees have some space in the social protection conversation, and very inclusive space at that, we still find very clear challenges and needs of funding. We find needs of data gaps. And of course, we find needs of coordination. And I think finally, I see more time, we find the need of also begin to think of how we really can't do social protection as a short-term temporary support like humanitarian aid. We now need to start thinking, as governments, as partners, as development actors, or how to begin to translate into sort of long-term social protection, strategies that are sort of development focused. So I'm going to pause here. I see Jeanette is already nodding her head. I'm going to pass about to fellow panelists to pick up from there. Thank you, Jeanette.
Right. Yes, Ezine. And of course, if you have anything else to add, because we do want to get the full breadth of your thoughts, we'll be coming to you with a specific question. So please, if there's something that you feel you wanted to add to that context that you've set, please feel free once we come back to you to add that point. But thank you very much, Ezine. The same question, again, I'll go across to Andrew, Jane, and Sean, and I'll go to you, Andrew. You've heard Ezine just from her thoughts. The question was a little bit about how you can describe the current landscape of social protection for refugees and immigrants in Africa, and what you see as pressing needs and gaps that you continue to observe. So Andrew, just 1 or 2 minutes to give us that, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you, Ezine, for a very elaborate kind of introduction to this. And looking at the landscape, I would literally get to the Kenyan space and look at refugee population. Looking at the landscape, Kenya has actually hosted the refugee population for over 30 years. And so from the humanitarian aspect, this is more of a protracted situation where more of solutions are needed. And in terms of solutions, then it is more of development solutions. And looking at development solutions, social protections or investment in social protection is actually considered as one of those development solutions that reach out to the most vulnerable. Looking at how the government of Kenya has continually progressed in terms of managing the refugee situation in Kenya, the Refugee Act of 2021 actually gives refugees the right to socioeconomic inclusion. And so we have seen a transforming and a progressive policies at the social protection policy legal frameworks. We have seen the social protection policy of 2024 actually speaking to refugee inclusion and even the ongoing developments within the legal space. However, challenges just as have been enumerated, but now more specific to the refugee context, is that we have seen limited, as much as the social protection space in Kenya is developing, there is still very limited integration of refugees and asylum seekers into the national social protection systems. And this could be cutting from the national system all the way to the county government related systems. In terms of looking for solutions, refugee needs therefore are currently evolving in terms of how do they support their needs, and more so linking it to vulnerability. And so some of the main challenges that we still see is in terms of the legal gaps that are, of course, continuing to evolve, but we also see administrative gaps whereby you find maybe refugee identifications are not recognized within some national systems that would make them access social protection. We also see capacity constraints. We see issues around the physical space because we would need to have moral financing to actually have refugees integrated into national social protection systems. So a lot of progress has been made, but then I also believe that there is so much to do to make it sustainable in the long run. Thanks, Janet.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Again, just alluding similarly to what Ezine had mentioned, there's progress there, but some of these gaps around an integration seem to persist. Jane, again, coming to you to also highlight your thoughts on the gaps that continue to persist, describing the landscape of social protection, the way you see it, and some of the challenges that need to be urgently addressed. Jane.
Thank you very much, Janet, and the participants and my fellow panelists. This is a very interesting conversation, and I thank my colleagues that we are having this conversation. Now, when you look at the social protection landscape, in Kenya, it's a growing sector, looking at how the whole concept of social protection is perceived. And when we look at the aspect of refugees, the Refugee Act gives some provision, as my brother Andrew has alluded to. And I would not want to maybe go back to what it is that Andrew has talked to. But part of that landscape and the challenge that comes in with us is from the social sector is on the issues of documentation. Most of these people are running away and they come with no documentation. The issues of family separation become a critical challenge, especially when it comes to children. And that also poses a challenge in terms of how then do we have a gender lens when we are programming for refugees? And gender lens, we also want to tweak it to include issues of disability. Because remember, these are people who are running away from different vulnerabilities. And we need to be able to come up with programming that is gender sensitive and that is also disability sensitive. And also tweak it to also have a child lens in that, because children at the end of the day are vulnerable and they suffer most. In terms of the capacity, there is definitely a gap in terms of how well are we prepared. Do we have a framework for anticipatory actions when it comes to dealing with our refugees? How is that framework going to be panned out? Because we need to have that anticipatory framework so that we are able to have a shorter turnaround in terms of interventions. So I believe that this conversation should be able to give us more clearer thought in terms of how do we want to change this space and lobby for the funding and also lobby for more visibility of what it is that is being done with the refugee community. Thank you very much, and back to you, Janet.
All right. Thank you, Jane, also for bringing in issues of the gender lens. I think that's really interesting to unpack. Shana, we're coming to you to paint the context, and then I'll kind of also come back to you with the first initial specific question. Before we do that, we still want to ask our participants, our viewers, if you will, if you have any questions or comments that start to come to mind, please make sure you use the Q&A feature to bring them up right now. Shana, just, you've heard our colleagues right now describing the current landscape of social protection as you see it for refugees and immigrants in Africa and the most pressing needs and gaps that you currently observe.
Yes, thank you very much. It's difficult to go last because after previous speakers made such good points and covered so many points already. So maybe just to say that we are not just facing a gap in the region when it comes to refugees, but even for nationals, right? So according to the last World Social Protection Report, we see that Africa in itself, I'm going to go now really big, is still lagging at like 19% of coverage for social protection behind the global average of like 52%. So, I mean, we're struggling to close that gap, both for nationals and for non-nationals or forcibly displaced persons or migrant workers. So if we look at refugees specifically in the region, most, as colleagues have already said, are legally or practically excluded. Madam Jane just mentioned the issue, for example, of documentation from national social protection schemes. So we do make this big differentiation between partner-provided and national schemes, right? So if we look at refugees, most of them benefit from international partners, as Ezin has already mentioned, in the camps or settlements. But then if we look at urban refugees in many of the countries here in the region, they're actually left out and they only get, for example, life-saving treatment, or they don't get any cash transfers. So they are often there to fend for themselves. Sometimes they're included in cash transfers, but usually really if international partners pay for it, like the UPSNP in Ethiopia. And so otherwise, if they don't get that, then they're left to fend for themselves. So I think that's also an important differentiation, to not just look at refugees in a country, you know, in its entirety, but really looking at the different settings and the different situations, because urban refugees are often also particularly vulnerable. You know, they have to leave the camps, for example, in Kenya, due to protection issues sometimes. And so what we've also seen in the region is that countries are much more open to include refugees in their social health protection schemes over all the other schemes. So those can be contributory schemes like in Rwanda, or national health schemes that are publicly financed like in Uganda. But we still see a big gap in really integrating refugees at par with nationals, even for social health protection. And then again, we come back also to the question of who is going to pay for it. So the whole issue of domestic finance and fiscal space is really an issue. And I think the last point is that we have this realization that governments across the region have really seen during COVID that workers in the informal economies, nationals and non-nationals, are particularly vulnerable to shocks, and that usually social protection systems in this region rather cater to workers in the formal sector. So apart from the legal recognition and inclusion, refugees, of course, face an extra variety of barriers, but one of them includes proper employment opportunities to contribute to social protection schemes. So that's my few points, and happy to continue later.
Right. Yes, we'll keep with you, Shana, just as we head on to this next session around policy and legal frameworks. And you've already kind of set the tone in some way. You've mentioned how in some spaces there's a lot of times that people have to fend for themselves, and just some of these policies that need to be strengthened a bit. And so I'd like you to speak to some of the policies and legal frameworks that you consider most effective, just in ensuring refugees have reliable and equitable access to social protection. And then on top of that, highlight any best practices that governments and stakeholders in the refugee sector could adopt to enhance refugee-focused interventions. You've highlighted some of the gaps, so maybe come back to us with what are some of the best practices that we can begin to consider. Back over to you, Shana.
Okay, thank you. So I think the first thing when we look at international standards and legal inclusion is, of course, the ratification and application of international and regional legal instruments. Yeah, they're the first step towards the extension of social protection to refugees and their families. But even if countries have not ratified those, they can already incorporate some of the principles embedded in these frameworks in their national frameworks. So, of course, the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 protocol are the cornerstones of international refugee protection, and they're the first thing that should be ratified by countries. These includes access to food, shelter, education, employment, as well as protection against refoulement. So this is the first thing. Then we see, as we already, a lot of the speakers have now noticed, refugees are often legally excluded from social protection due to the principle of territoriality of social protection and nationality. So one of the things we ask for is we've worked at, for example, with Madam Jane and Andrew in Kenya, is to make social protection policies or policies across the board in countries more open by not saying it's for citizens or for nationals. This already helps a lot by not legally excluding them from the onset. We at least give some room for these, more inclusive approaches. So saying anybody who resides in a country already helps a lot. And then when countries build inclusive social protection systems, they should really base them on the equality treatment principles embedded in the international labor standards. So the ILO recommendations 202 calls for the establishment of social protection floors, which provide universal social protection, including refugees and displaced populations. So this inclusion at par with nationals is really key. So what we see a lot in countries is that if we include them in national contributory schemes, governments, for example, are not so keen to give them the, let's say, lowest contribution rates. They say, well, partners might potentially pay for it, or some of these contribution rates are government subsidized. So refugees should pay the highest. That already then is really puts into question the sustainability of these approaches, right? Because refugees do not have more funds or income than the nationals. So it makes it very unaffordable. So this whole question of affordability, acceptability of social protection scheme is quite key. Again, the key social security principles should guide any policy development. And we see that like the solidarity in financing, periodical and predictable payments, for example, instead of just paying out a lump sum. And when countries really make this effort to promote coherent approaches, between labor migration, employment, social protection, refugee protection in these policies, it's much more effective. Because in the end, we also want to see people being able to contribute. And so this whole question of employment and income is a big challenge that we see for refugees when they're facing so many challenges to work and to access work permits in the region. Then, of course, it's much harder for them to contribute to contributory schemes. So this is one thing. The other thing is, of course, to really have a look at their own, when countries develop these policies, to look at their own social protection scheme and to consider like the labor migration and mobilities landscape, the availability and level and scope of social protection provisions in the country of origin and destination, and what the situation is for refugees and their family members. So including demographics, migration, residence, employment status, duration of stay. So of course, we have very different approaches that countries can take if it's a protracted crisis or a very like short-term displacement situation. And lastly, I think in the end, we see that some of the countries are becoming more open to open up their national systems for refugees at par with nationals, and then to really include them in various schemes. So we've already talked about Uganda, where now refugees have much more rights to access land, freedom of movement, etc. So this is really the slow, gradual move away from this humanitarian approach, right, to like more integrative policies. We've also seen, for example, in Rwanda, where it's a good example where urban refugees are now part of the CBHI, the community-based health insurance scheme, and can access those services at par with nationals. I think I'll stop here because we have more people speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, very helpful, Shana. Thank you for giving us those points. And, we're going to bring them in shortly and integrate them with some of the other questions we have. Before we move on to the next panelist, just thank you to all of you who are already sending in your questions and comments. Please remember to use the Q&A button. Use the Q&A button. Tell us where you're from. Give us some context on some of the remarks you're hearing today. And then you can ask your question. Try and keep it as succinct as possible. But thank you so much for doing that. And do remember to use the hashtags. If you're sharing this webinar across your platforms, those hashtags are social protection, hashtag migration, hashtag social impact, and hashtag funding for impact. So thank you again for just keeping updated with this conversation and sharing it. And Shana, once again, thank you for those critical remarks that you've made. And still speaking to policy and legal frameworks, I'd now like to bring in Mr. Andrew Agumba, who introduced himself earlier, to give the Kenyan context and what are the biggest policy and legal challenges in integrating refugees into national social protection systems. Are there any notable recent advancements or ongoing efforts in improving quality and social protection access to refugees, something we've seen as a challenge over the last number of years? So Andrew, your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much, Shana, for giving the very global perspective. Looking at the narrowing down to advancements that have been made. And I did begin my earlier remarks by mentioning that the refugee situation in Kenya has been here for a while. Right now, we are at over 800,000. In all this, there are a number of advancements that have been made when it comes to social protection. And of course, social protection programming would literally need legal standing. And so a number of advancements has been made when it comes to inclusion of refugees into the legal frameworks. The Ministry of Social Protection, through the secretariat that Madam Jane leads, has been very critical in advancing. One key thing that I would mention at this point is that we have seen very transformative legal frameworks like the Refugee Act of 2021 that gives refugees right to socioeconomic inclusion. We have also seen the social protection policy of 2024 that also speaks to refugees as well. We are currently working together with the government, the ministry, of course, in terms of coming up with the Social Protection Act, and in that also the language also includes refugees. So a lot of progress is made in terms of legal framework, but then in all these different progress that we have seen in the legal framework, there are still some barriers that we can still see because there is limited alignment. As much as the Refugee Act of 2021 gives right to socioeconomic inclusion, we have seen limited refugee participation in socioeconomic activities, either because they don't have opportunities or because the administrative barriers that actually make them not to participate in some of the economic activities that could be there. And looking at the social protection landscape, as had been mentioned by Madam Jane and colleagues, is that the social protection framing in Kenya looks at contributory social protection and also looks at non-contributory social protection. And for contributory social protection, for example, NSSF or the SHA that we are heading towards, or NSSF like Haba, someone needs to make an individual contribution. But therefore, the barrier around participation into economic activities limits refugees in participating on social protection programs. When I go down to the issues around non-contributory social protection, like cash assistance and all this, refugees 30 years down the line are still largely dependent on humanitarian support, which is not sustainable with the fluid humanitarian space that we have. And so when support reduces, then it means more and more refugees are not cushioned through humanitarian support. And also, if they are not cushioned, then it means their vulnerabilities increase, and meaning that once they are not included into these social assistance programs, then we have challenges in that. However, we have also noticed that one key issue that is on this is lack of data, integrated data, because social protection programming in the country depends on integrated data system that enhancing registry. And a number of refugees, or actually a big chunk of refugees, are not included into the ESR system. And how, as much as we are working with the State Department to have this come to pass, this is still a barrier because it makes them not to be visible at the planning phase, visible in programming, and also visible in terms of using their data or having their data in the right place to make decisions. I would also really speak to the issue around documentation again, because a number of refugees have challenges accessing national systems, including social protection, because their identification, though issued by the national government, they are not interoperable with other national government systems. And so refugees therefore get it very hard, as was mentioned by Madam Jane, that they are not able to locate which refugee is in need, or even for other different programmings that come about. So a number of challenges here that I believe we can still scale, but looking at how do we integrate data, how do we have legal systems speaking to them, and how do we actually have sufficient funding, and also ensuring that we can have refugees targeted through other systems or other programs that are really existing. So thank you so much, Janet, and that would be my submission on the refugee situation in Kenya. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Andrew and Shana. So really giving that context and on policy and legal frameworks. And Andrew, you've really drawn that scope of, locally, sort of what are some of these barriers, whether it's integration of data. Shana, I wondered whether you'd want to add anything over and above what Andrew has said. He's given quite a local context. You've also come and given this global sort of context. Any similarities that you would want to draw, or any just kind of final policy matters that you'd want to share before we move into the next session, Shana?
Thank you. As I will come back with some of these examples from Kenya myself in the next intervention, I'll not add, because Andrew and I work so closely together that I feel he captured everything. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you both for really just showcasing these policy and legal gaps which continue to affect the integration, I think, and services and access to services of refugees. I'd like to move us on to the next session, which is really going to look at the intersection between humanitarian response and social assistance. And with that, I'd like to bring in Ezine and maybe ask you, how can we ensure more efficient and impact-focused spending of development and domestic resources in the social protection sector? And additionally, what role does data play in guiding resource allocation decisions to better support refugees and immigrants in Africa? Ezine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. So I suppose thinking through efficient spending, I think similar to what Shana, I think a few other panelists, colleagues have mentioned, just think of it like in a spectrum. So first of all is, before we make our spending efficient, we need to sort of help governments raise a bit more funding, because we're seeing that the resources at the moment are not enough. And that begins to look into how do we support governments, begins to sort of increase the fiscal space that they have. And when we talk about trying to mobilize, for instance, domestic resources, what very practical things can we do to support the government? Conversations around, for instance, trying to manage the cost of sovereign financing, for instance, to be able to free up resources and go into more social protection solutions for refugees and nationals. Conversations around as well as trying to see if we can increase or widen the net of contributions, very reasonable, of course, and where feasible. But also more discussions around how can we also help the national governments handle a bit more financing from the private sector or from other sources as well, just sort of increase that basket of resources. And so on that very first basis or very first step in the cascade of trying to get more money into the pots of social protection for governments that they could spend or use for refugees and host communities or nationals. And now moving from that now into saying, in a situation where you have raised this money, or in a situation as we see now, that the resources are constantly dwindling, even the donor world priorities are shifting. Now, how can we support, or how can we ensure that what we have is used as efficient as possible? So I think there is first the conversation of trying to make sure that we have clear coordination and that you're not duplicating efforts. So one thing we see, for instance, with our work in Uganda, in Ethiopia, for instance, where you have lots of partners working, is that sometimes you find the challenge of fragmentation. I think a few colleagues had mentioned that earlier. But of course, the implication of fragmentation is that you find in cases where the same services are being sort of duplicated, or there's an overlap, and these are resources that if there was a better coordination, right, it could be channeled appropriately, or it could be spent a bit more efficiently. So there is that very first conversation of saying, can we, as partners and as governments, can we begin to sort of have stronger coordination systems? And to your second point around data, this is where data can come in to really help you have a really good way of seeing the different services, the different interventions in social protection going on in different areas in the countries, and how the different partners are working there, and where opportunities exist to sort of, consolidate efforts, consolidate resources, and sort of make the spending a lot more efficient. And I think recently in Uganda, for instance, where we're trying to support Office of the Prime Minister come up with such a framework, like a results framework that can help them see at a glance where are the resources in refugee response and social protection going to, and where do you have opportunities to consolidate resources across partners and be more targeted in the spending. Then, of course, the second bit of it is, you can't harmonize and coordinate and really try to close up all the loops. And that is extremely useful. But there's also the very clear question of how are you spending your money? And I think that's the very, one of the very key things, for us in the social protection spaces. You have a lot of resources going in through activity-based contracting, through different ways of contracting, really. And are there ways we can begin to explore how to begin to mainstream much more outcome-focused? Andrew and Shana and Madam Janet has all talked about, we are now seeing a situation where, for instance, the resources are clearly dwindling, quite all right. But we're also seeing situations, particularly where we have to move now from short-term spending to more long-term spending. And when you have limited resources, you need to start thinking of, what's the long-term play here? And so one of the things that could be useful is begin to think of, are there ways that result-based financing, or, in some other words, outcome-based contracting, can begin to support that slow transition of having a different mindset to how spending is done in the social protection space, and begin to tie, finance into more tangible outcomes. You're already seeing this happening, for instance, in Uganda and Ethiopia with the Dr. D program, where already with the performance-based contracting, the government and the World Bank is beginning to tie tangible outcomes to financing for refugees, for host communities, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to education, when it comes to health, and begin already to, use what you have as efficiently as possible. And we also see this, one of the work we're doing in Ethiopia really is trying to work with the government of Ethiopia to see how, with the social safety, social protection program they have that has employment and, and livelihood sort of like, components, how can we begin to design tangible outcome metrics that the program finance or the program funding can be tied to ensure a bit more accountability to what is important to participants and what is important as well to governments, right, and all the other actors in the space. Because like we said, the money is dwindling. And so when you think of, you strengthen your coordination, you think of how what you have, you spend a bit more targets, right, a bit more targetedly, and trying as much as possible to give a lot more flexibility. When we talk about result-based financing, beyond helping you to target and sort of condition your payment to pure outcomes, it also gives you flexibility, because as we see, that transition from short-term to long-term development-focused social protection, it's very dynamic. Things change very quickly. And so we did want to create space where actors working in that environment have the flexibility to respond to those dynamics or to those emerging, needs, and contracting or spending your money based on results can help you do that. But also moving beyond, coordination, moving beyond result-based financing, we also sort of talking through, even within what you have as government and within the partnerships you have, how can you also leverage much more strategic partnerships to be more efficient in your spending? A classic example is just trying to clarify, economics of scope or economies of scale. What can I do better? Or what can I allow the other actor to do? And so with strategic partnerships, for instance, you have a situation where you have partners working, you have governments working, but can we really begin to say, instead of one person having to provide a service by de facto, of their position, can we have someone who is a lot more, experienced in that area, a lot more established in that area, that has a lot more infrastructure to deliver those services, just so that it saves us a big cost, right, in trying to do things that we're not quite familiar with. And so there is that element of with strategic partnerships, literally leveraging that very carefully to see how can we, use our comparative advantage, particularly in the social protection space, to deliver services more efficiently and more effectively. And this ties into the data conversation, because of course, you're thinking through how you can plan properly, you're thinking through how you can mobilize resources properly. You have to be able to have strong data. Madam Janet talked earlier, and I think Andrew as well, having an anticipatory framework. when you have strong data, it helps you know where to target your resources. You can sort of, anticipate where the displacement trends, for instance, are going to be more, or the needs are going to be more. So it helps you begin to focus your money on where is needed, because also your resources are very limited at this point. But also going beyond your planning is now trying to also track, are you getting this need to the right people? When you have very limited resources, you begin to ask yourself, am I reaching the right people? And so having very clear integrated social registries in Uganda right now, I think with UNHCR, the government has the integrated social assistance registry, where they begin to see a bit more, consolidated data on the social services being offered to both nationals and refugees. And with this, you begin to see now where are the most vulnerable groups, so that you can focus your resources on those groups. But also going beyond that as well is, when we talk about targeting your financing with result-based financing, you really need strong data to do that, because we're talking about payment based on results, or payment based on outcomes that are useful as you think of this long-term focused development journey. And so, of course, you need to have strong data to be able to demonstrate where results has happened, tangible results, and to be able to, make the payment that go along with that. And finally, of course, there's a transparency conversation. In all these things going on, we need to be able to see clearly, how can data also help us be efficient? If we can begin to leverage digital systems, for instance, for this integrated, data and social protection, it does save you the cost of having to, spend more when you're collecting your data, for example. But more importantly, also, you begin to leverage the power of data in spending your money more efficiently. And so I think in general, in summary, the conversation between how you make your financing or your spending more efficient and the role of data, this is such a direct relationship that one cannot go with the other. So, but I'm happy to share more, Janet, as we go on some of these other examples, particularly where with our work at Instiglio, where also we have seen that governments more and more are beginning to embrace result-based financing, particularly as a bridge, as you move from short-term solutions to long-term solutions and make your resources a lot more targeted. Thank you.
All right. No, thank you, Ezine. And I think some of your sharings along with your peers is also generating a lot of interest. So for our participants, the chat is open. I think a lot of you want to share what it is that you're hearing. Some of you might even be people who fully understand this kind of work. So please interact with each other. The chat is now open, as well as using the Q&A button feature to ask any questions you might have. Also, don't forget to continue using the hashtags. These are what will allow us to track this conversation, and you can share it with peers and colleagues. That's hashtag social protection, hashtag migration, hashtag social impact, and hashtag funding for impact. You can also find the handles for our co-conveners today at CHASP KE and at Instiglio Inc. That's on the X platform. So you continue as well to just interact with them beyond this particular session. So we are still continue to talk about the intersection between humanitarian response and social assistance. And, Ezine has raised a lot of critical points, whether it's about clear coordination, resourcing, how do we avoid duplicating efforts, a lot of that. And now I'd like to bring Jane Muyanga in. I also want to acknowledge the 90 or so participants that we have with us. Please continue to use the chat box just to let us know your reactions and responses to the conversations. Jane, as we continue to look at this intersection, what practical steps can be taken to strengthen the integration between humanitarian response and long-term social assistance programs for African immigrants and refugees? That question again is, what steps can be taken to strengthen that integration between humanitarian response and long-term social assistance programs for African immigrants and refugees? So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you very much, colleagues. I think when we are looking at this whole concept of the intersection between humanitarian assistance and the refugees and social assistance, we need to start looking at it from when we talk of social assistance, what are we basically looking at? And here we are looking at both contributory and non-contributory schemes. And when we are looking at these two schemes, we are asking ourselves, so what is the most practical way of ensuring that both the refugees and immigrants are able to access those benefits? And one of the practical routes that I would look at is the use of technology. We have in Kenya the enhanced single registry that has been developed to just host data for the poor and vulnerable households. And we have had discussion with Andrew and Shanna in terms of the onboarding of refugees into the ESR through a special module. And that module should be able to support any agency that wants to do cash transfer or any other social assistance to the refugees. Through the use of technology, in my view, we can have quite a number of easy wins and low-hanging fruits that we can pick. Through technology, we can have a simplified registration process. Those of us in the space know that the biggest challenge for refugees is having registration documents. It takes a bit longer than anticipated. Supposing we were to use technology to simplify that registration process, how would that pan itself out? I'm sure that is one of the issues that will be able to bridge that gap between the humanitarian assistance and the overall social programming for long-term benefits for the refugees. The other issue that, or the other technology platform that we can use is the use of mobile-based platforms. And I'm sure the way technology has evolved in Kenya, if we were just to have a specific mobile platform for these refugees to be able to register and even contribute for their share, be able to contribute for their social security through Haba Haba, which has been rolled off by NSSF. I am sure these people can be able to save for their old age or for their health. And this can be able to make it easier for them because they'll be able to use their mobile gadgets. The other aspect that I think a practical step is to making the contributions flexible, have a flexible contribution structure. And this still goes to how we will design the platforms that we need to develop for this group of our people. The other issue that we need to maybe learn and pick up is learning from the Kalobaye scheme, the inclusion into our economic inclusion programs. In my view, this is something that we can be able to pick and also include other programs like government is has rolled out the economic inclusion and the CHASP program. And I believe if we were to roll out these in the schemes where these people are, where they are supported through mentorship to start their own businesses, then we would have more long-term sustainable issues, or families will be able to sustain themselves better than when they are going for relief and support. Because as we have said before, the fiscal space for support of refugees and immigrants is shrinking. So how can we help them be able to sustain themselves? We can also come up with other issues of nutrition. Some of these children, some of these families, like we've said, come through difficult times, and sometimes they come with children who are malnourished. How can we come up with those programs that can be able to cater for these group of people, such that even in whatever scenario they find themselves in, the nutritional support, especially for children under 5, is part of what is considered for greater outcomes at the end of the day. The other issue that maybe in practical step we need to look at critically is on the issues of the care economy. Like I had earlier said, some of these children come from and old people, persons with disabilities, lose their family members or get separated from their family members in the course of their escape. And we need to ask ourselves, in these refugee camps and other places where these displaced or immigrants are, what is the status of care for children, for aged population, and persons with disabilities? Do we have structures that can be able to take care of these people, and how can we support those structures to be able to be sustainable? So at the end of the day, we want to be able to look at how does this whole system pan itself out. The other issue that we need also to look at in the context of the long-term social protection aspect is on issues of education. We know our refugees are able to access education. They're able to transit. But the issue is, like, for example, if you're in Kenya and you even transit, go to a private university and graduate, are you able to access jobs like the rest of the Kenyans? So these are some of the issues that we need to really kind of look through and ask ourselves, how do we want to make education a more sustainable and long-term benefit for the refugees and the migrants wherever they are? And the other thing we also need to ask ourselves is the education system that we are offering compatible with the education systems of the countries that they are coming from? The other issue, like I had said, is on the issue of social security, the issue of haba-haba. And we ask ourselves, what is the portability of those benefits? If I'm a Sudanese and I've been contributing to social security through haba-haba and I go back to my country, am I able to continue with that benefit in my country? So I think we need to start looking and asking ourselves, how is the integration within the African region going to be in terms of portability of benefits, in terms of integration for refugees that come, get their skills in the different countries, and they go back to their countries? Are those skills recognized? Because in my view, that is the only way we can have a long-term sustainability of the programs and interventions that are undertaken for the refugees. On social assistance, like we had earlier said, in most countries, social cash transfers are not provided to the refugees by governments. And I think we all know this is due to the fiscal space that exists within the various countries. And we need to start having a more serious conversation in terms of where do these people fit when it comes to social assistance? Because remember, there's also the issue that they pay taxes in one way or another through the VAT of the consumption support that they get. And we need to be able to have that conversation as to how we are going to involve all these people into all these particular sector. So Janet and panelists, in a nutshell, that is what basically we are looking at. But in my view, if we can embrace technology, it can simplify for us most of these challenges that we are facing in terms of registration, in terms of payment platforms, in terms of contribution, and in terms of the inclusion into the economic space. Because through a mobile platform, they can even be able to do their own savings and be able to be more self-sustaining and not necessarily having to rely on the adults that are given through the interventions that come along. Thank you very much. Over back to you, Janet.
All right. Thank you, Jane. So Jane, they're really prioritizing technology as a solution in being able to integrate refugees and immigrants when it comes to social protection and that humanitarian response intersection. Thank you to both you and Ezine for really giving those layered sort of answers and intersections that could actually yield some really great access, in a sense. And we're seeing a lot of people participating in the chat, having their own expertise, asking certain questions. We encourage you to keep doing that and to use the hashtags. The team that's behind the scenes on this webinar is also going to be including those hashtags, etc., in the chat so that you can begin to use them. We'd now like to move into another section of this conversation. We've just talked about that intersection of humanitarian response and social protection, and now we're moving to strategic partnerships and results-based approaches to incentivize impact. So let's move on to that, and we can invite Shana back, who's going to answer the question on how can strategic partnerships between government, international organizations, and local stakeholders be utilized to create results-driven social protection systems for refugees in Africa. Shana, over to you.
Thank you. And I also wanted to highlight what Madame Jane just said, that refugees are contributing with tax funding. I think it's very important. I think there's one of the things that we see a lot in the discussions with our partners is that this is a bit overlooked. And I also wanted to make the point again, because there were some questions on the chat. So just to say how important for us it is to really see social protection as this life cycle approach that, you know, covers you across life cycle. So this whole ILO idea of social protection floors, because sometimes also when we discuss it, there's a lot of this focus of partners to move people or graduate people out of social protection. And that only works if you're like giving them basically cash transfers for the poor, right? But you will always be in need of health and old age protection and child protection. So just to make those 2 points, because I just wanted to, I didn't want to type them in the chat. So yeah, why is it important that all the different partners come together? I think it's really important when we look at where we are at, that international organizations, both, I think you've seen that in the chat as well, humanitarian and development partners, governments and local stakeholders like NGOs, community groups, private sector, really come together. The project I work for is also quite, showcasing that by having those different partner agencies and really trying to bring those stakeholders together. I think also the principle of like nothing about us without us, right, is key in the development of acceptable employment, social protection policies, and transitioning refugees into the national schemes. So stakeholders really need to come together to align those policy frameworks to reflect and prioritize refugees' needs and to make sure that they're really acceptable for refugees and the realities that this specific group also faces. So Madame Jane has already mentioned the Haba Haba scheme in Kenya, and without going into the scheme itself, I think we saw that when government and international partners and refugee groups come together, we saw that there's a lot of aspects that need to be tweaked, let's say, to really make this a successful, program and product for refugees. So one of them, the things that we found is the UNHCR factor, as I like to call it. So refugees have inherent trust issues when it comes to national services. On the one hand, they come from countries where this national trust and this whole principle of trust has been eroded, of course. And then, of course, they often come to countries where they are not necessarily have the right to freedom of movement. They don't get national services. So this whole trust issue in the national services is eroded. So once UNHCR comes in and can really promote something, it did change the whole perception of the scheme. The same goes for mobile payment. It's difficult for refugees, even for nationals often, but for refugees even more, to save into something they cannot see and where they have never interacted with a person. So again, making sure that there's also service points where people can directly go, overcoming language barriers and having all this information translated into various languages, and then overcoming operational problems. And what I've also seen in the chat, one of the biggest things we see in Kenya, for example, is the issue with the IDs, right? If you have a backlog of IDs and people don't have an ID, it really reduces their access across the board to any social protection scheme. If it's I think they changed the name again yesterday for the health insurance in Kenya. But if it's for the health insurance or if it's for Haba Haba, you need a functioning recognized ID. And we see that again with other basic services like access to banking, mobile money. These things need to really be overcome to get refugees properly enrolled. And then what Madame Jane also mentioned, we need to now also test, does it really work to get your payments out? Because if you're a returnee and you pay in the formal sector, for example, you could take your funds out, right, to your home country if there's a bilateral agreement. For Haba Haba, it's just a saving. So basically it would be possible now, we tweak that with NSSF to get the payment out if you leave the country. These, I mean, I'm going to very technical details here, but these technical details matter for the target group and to make this acceptable for the refugee population. So then on another hand, I mean, we have heard from Madam Jane as well how important it is that stakeholders come together, because all of this requires really multi-sectoral approaches. So we need to look at education, at health, at housing, at employment, and only if those, you know, different aspects in the policy landscape are really dealt with on the different levels as well, can we really see bigger and lasting change. And then maybe the last point I think that we've seen is if we are talking about the inclusion of refugees in national systems and government taking over, it is of course key to really plan this jointly with the different partners from the onset, and to properly evaluate, for example, who will potentially bear the costs in the short term and in the long term. So if we're looking at trends globally, right, more and more people are on the move and forcibly displaced. At the same time, budgets are being cut. So partners are not going to be able at some point to bear this caseload. So if we want to make this sustainable, it's also a question of really transitioning over time to governments that have pledged to, you know, take care of the refugee populations in their countries, and at the same time making refugees as independent and self-sufficient as possible. So this whole idea of getting them access to the labor market is, of course, one of the key aspects. And it requires capacity building on all levels. If it's the international partners, it's also government, it's also the counties and local NGOs. So just last point maybe is that one last thing that we have to see in reality, often refugees have better services than nationals. If they are in a remote location, in a camp, they do get better services potentially than locals. So it is important when we transition, like in Kenya with the Sharika plan, over time, we transition to more government-led services, that these services do not reduce in quality, right? So this is why at least ILO has taken a very strong aspect of system strengthening. So really working with, let's say, NHIF in Sudan and Kenya, well, before we had civil war in Sudan, but UHIS in Egypt, EHIS in Ethiopia, to really strengthen the systems. Because, I mean, one clear message is that if the system doesn't work for nationals, it's not going to work for refugees, right? And you don't want to take away services from refugees. So this is also why these different levels are really, really key to then, ensure that the target group receives their social protection services over time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shana. If the service doesn't work for nationals, the service doesn't work for refugees. Something to reflect on there. We're seeing a lot of comments from really different parts of the country, Garissa, Turkana. So really appreciate you participating from different parts of the country, the region, the world. We thank you for sharing your insights and your questions. And soon we're going to be coming to that Q&A section of this webinar, but we still have another question here within the session of strategic partnerships and results-based approaches to incentivize impact. And this time it's to Ezine. What is the current experience with coordination amongst actors in the refugee sector? Can talk about hits or misses. And do you have any specific ideas on how to progressively improve coordination in the refugee sector? Over to you, Ezine.
Thank you so much, Janet. It's a very important question. So I think, first of all, when we think about the coordination and sort of what is going on so far, I think from the conversation today from Madam Janet, Andrew, and also Shana, I think there's already a lot of collaboration and coordination going on in the refugee space, particularly with the government, donors, partners, NGOs. From a policy perspective and even framework perspective, from many years ago, you have like all of the conventions, the OAE convention in the 1950s, the recent one, 2004, for Cotonou Declaration, all of these declarations thinking through how, all affirming and acclaiming that stakeholders, are working together and indeed plan to continue working together, having shared responsibility, but also promoting, long-term solutions. You see that also a lot more reinforced recently with the Global Compact for Refugees, and even the CRF. That a lot of the countries like Uganda, Ethiopia have all sort of adopted. And so there are lots of hits when it comes to coordination, where even from a pure framework perspective, actors, governments, donors, partners are recognizing and realizing that they need to work together to focus on long-term solutions, right? And you have all these frameworks, trying to drive that discussion. But also beyond that, from a programmatic perspective, already you see that happening. Shanna talked about the project she's working on. In Uganda already you have the Dr. Deep program, which is a development response to displacement impact. Is also there in Ethiopia. Already with our work in Ethiopia, we have the TILA program, where already you find that, government partners, private sector, they're all coming together. They're all realizing that we need to work together. We have shared responsibility, but more importantly, you have to think of long-term solutions. So in terms of the hits, there are this, already existing, partnerships and already evidence of refugee actors coming together to say, how can we work together to focus on long-term solutions? Also, how can we share responsibility? So the conversation is ongoing, but it's a process, it's a journey. I think when it comes to the misses, I think there's a very core fact of when we talk about long-term solutions, the financing perspective, is our financing reflecting that declaration, that willingness to look towards long-term solutions, to look towards sustainability. And so when it comes to the coordination efforts of refugee actors, we find that the financing is a bit, contradictory to the picture of having long-term solutions, where donor priorities, for instance, are very short-term, providing, short-term social assistance or social protection initiatives to refugees and migrants, but not necessarily always thinking long-term. But of course, recently we've seen the gradual progression, but that is still a miss that needs to still be worked on. But also in that conversation of long-term solutions, it's a very practical conversation of fiscal space, right? We're thinking about ultimately we want social protection when it includes refugees and nationals to be sustainable, and that requires financing. And I like when Shana was talking about like who pays for what, and beyond sort of getting governments to take on more responsibilities, is also sort of working with them practically to say, how do we help you improve and increase your fiscal space to be able to help you take on some of this, take on some of these long-term solutions that you coordinate with your partner. So that concept of shared responsibility has to be backed with clear financing that is focused on long-term solutions. I think another miss we see is the fragmentation conversation. So partners are working really well together, delivering services, but the coordination conversation, we still have, gaps when it comes to, the fragmentation of programs, interventions, being duplicated, some areas being neglected. We're also having, misses around even central coordination platforms. And I think part of the work we've been doing in Uganda is trying to sort of help with that central coordination, conversation. Can we help? Can we support the government to have a central digital platform where you can share information together with your partners, where you can, share data on impact on performance, where you can also very clearly track the gaps of when it comes to social protection, solutions in the country, where are the gaps still, and that gaps in a very sort of integrated manner. So that is still a miss, even though work is going on in that area. We also have, communication gaps. I think linked to the data gaps as well. It's sort of, you have limited coordination system, but you also have just like pure weak systems, right? Weak data systems. Sometimes you get like some data, sometimes it's difficult to get all the kind of data you need. And particularly also because sometimes in the refugee space, also people are sometimes transients trying to find, better welfare, better outcomes. So that does create a bit of challenge in trying to get quality data. But I think when it comes to the coordination conversation, if partners are able to continue with that spirit of all of these declarations, from the 50s all the way to 2018 with the GCR, if partners still continue with that concept of how can we keep a focus on long-term solutions, and how can we begin to reorient and repurpose our coordination effort to speak to long-term sustainable solutions in social protection, I think that would really help, sort of address some of these misses. And moving down on to the ideas of potential what could be useful. I mean, in a way, you find that these things are beginning to, interconnect all over again. I think there is the very clear conversation of, first of all, what is coordination focused on? I think there has to be, which I think we're already doing, but there's sort of an active realization of it, that when it comes to social protection, it's not a short-term conversation. When we're thinking of trying to include the refugees into the conversation and have it as an effort led by coordination, we have to think long-term, we have to think sustainability, which begins to beg the question again of how can we make our finances more efficient? Are there avenues, for instance, where outcome-based financing can help us begin to think of how to incentivize the inclusion of refugees in national systems, but also how to do that focus on tangible, outcomes. Say employment, for instance. Shana talked about how they also contribute to the economy. Can we use our ways of financing to begin to demonstrate that there is clear evidence that refugees contribute to the economic situation of the country? And with that, we begin to make a much, much stronger case of having governments begin to increase their physical space. So coordination conversations should be thinking around this, right? Long-term solutions of having centralized data systems, long-term solutions of reducing fragmentation, but also long-term solutions of how you work with local partners on the ground to ensure that as donors, as the processes are shrinking, that more and more you're having capacity in country that can begin to work together with the national government to deliver the social protection solutions a bit more effectively. So I think in summary, what I would say is when it comes to the hits are great, but when it comes to what we should focus on, we should be thinking of coordination effort now as purposed towards long-term solutions, towards sustainability, and having a clear shift from short-term temporary social protection solutions to more long-term. And I think with coordination conversations becoming focused on this, it's going to take some time, sure, but I think it gives us a much better chance, right, of getting to the point where we want to really encourage governments to, holistically embrace inclusion of refugees and migrants in national social protection systems.
All right. Thank you, Ezine. I think collectively there's been some pretty incredible low-hanging fruits, tangible solutions, short-term, long-term, around integration, around technology, around sustaining, and even the recommendation, I think that Ezine might have mentioned just now, which is a job creation and just data that can really show to all the possibilities when it comes to integration for social protection. So thank you so much. In moments, actually, we're going to be opening up Q&A just to be able to allow those who've been speaking to us to share their questions. If there's recommendations for strengthening social protection systems and approaches, I think this is really something that we can open up to the panelists. Briefly, any recommendations for strengthening social protection systems and approaches? I think some of you have already spoken to them, but if there's one or two of you who feel that based on what your colleagues have said on this webinar today, are there any specific recommendations for strengthening social protection systems and approaches that you'd want to share as we then go into the Q&A session, which is also going to be coming up shortly? So for this, we'll give it about 3 to 5 minutes. If we have any one of you, Jane, Shana, Ezine, Andrew, who just want to kind of share any recommendations. I can see Jane has raised her hand. So Jane, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Janet. And the one thing that we need to maybe pick up from here is the whole issue of coordination. How coordinated are we in the refugee sector? Because I think that is where the gap is. When you look at the way the other sectors, maybe let me use that word loosely, the other sectors that are dealing with social protection are, there is a lot of synergy, but I think we have a weak link in the sector that deals with the refugees, and maybe we need to pick it up and try to see how can we bring it back to the mainstream social protection docket, where some of these discussions are being held in terms of how we program and how we tailor our interventions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Jane. I think I also saw Andrew had his hand up. So Andrew, any recommendations that you'd want to give, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for a great discussion. And for me, the low-hanging fruits when it comes to inclusion and strengthening inclusive social protection is just ensuring that the systems are inclusive. For me, inclusion would mean inclusion of refugees into national systems, be it data systems, just to ensure that there is that visibility of who is in need or who is vulnerable. And the other thing for me is that the government of Kenya has made a lot of progress. In 2023, December, the government of Kenya made a pledge in the Global Refugee Forum to have refugees included into social protection systems by 2027. Now that speaks to that, but then what is the responsibility of others in terms of building that system? So how do the development partners, the international community, come in to support? Because we are also talking about the shared responsibility. I think it's a matter of making coordination work for us better from different aspects, but also strengthening data systems. And that would also need ensuring that documentations that are needed for refugees, either for participation in economic platforms, as well as inclusion into social services, can work out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, even for pointing out the fact that even though the government pledged during the function about making sure that there's going to be inclusion of social protection for refugees, you talked about, well, what's the responsibility of others, other organizations and other partners? So thank you for speaking to that. I'd now like to give us an opportunity to go to the Q&A to allow our panelists time to interact with those who shared questions. And what I'll do is I'll ask a round of initial questions to all of our panelists and then come back and ask another round. And depending on time, hopefully we'll also allow you to give any closing remarks or final thoughts on the same. So we have initial questions here. And I'll start with the ones that have been posed for Shana. So we have Nicholas Midiwo asking, in light of the EAC protocols, and since most refugees in Kenya come from the EAC regional bloc, what are the plans for cross-border engagements to enhance social protection mechanisms? So Shana, if you've just gotten a grasp of that question, again, I'll ask a set of questions to all our panelists and then come back. And then we have questions for Shana. There's another question here that says, from Richard Rory, refugees are a vulnerable category of non-nationals and should have the same rights as citizens. Article 56 of the Kenyan Constitution, the Refugee Act 2021, talks about Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, established the right to social security for refugees. I interacted with a group of refugees in Mombasa, Kenya, and the biggest challenge facing them is delay in documentation to establish their identity, nationality, and legal status. I met one who's been in Kenya for over 30 years and says she actually cried. How can this process be fast-tracked? So please take note of those questions, Shan, and remember that if anybody also wants to interact or add on, you can also complement what Shana would have said. Jane, your questions. How can African countries develop inclusive and sustainable social protection systems that address the specific vulnerabilities of migrants and displaced persons while balancing national resources and regional integration? That's from Emmanuel Lokusi, who's asking how they can develop inclusive and sustainable social protection systems. Komora from Tana River County. This is a question as well, Jane, will pose to you. How can host countries address the economic challenges of providing social protection for refugees and immigrants while ensuring support for their local populations? And what role can digital financial services and community-based approaches play to enhance the delivery of social protection to refugee and immigrant populations? So Jane, you touched on technology, so I think you can circle back and answer that specific question. Andrew, if I can come to you with the initial set of questions for you. Grace Musolo has said, good morning, thank you for the insightful conversation so far. What is the place of cultural awareness in the policy frameworks and security risk assessment aggravated by quote unquote rogue elements within the refugee and asylum seekers? Okay, and Jacinta Omondi has also asked if one of the panelists can share their experience in terms of data sharing between UNHCR, my apologies, and the social registry. And I believe, Ezine, if we can come to your round of questions. Peter Osaji says, it will be nice to know how we are tracking the progress or otherwise of mainstreaming refugees into social protection levers in various countries. What are we doing about real-time tracking and monitoring of these efforts? And then I know there's another question here for Ezine that asks from Gabriel Wafula, how can governments and international organizations collaborate to strengthen data collection and analysis on migration flows and the needs of refugees? I'm going to pause there. For any of our panelists, please, if you didn't catch that, I'm happy to repeat one or two of the questions, but we'll open it up to answer this round of questions. So you can always switch on your camera and video and unmute and kind of go into some of these questions which have been asked. Jane, I can see you're ready to go, and then each of you will come in one by one, and feel free as well to add on to what your peers are saying. So Jane, are you happy with your question? You can proceed to answer it.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you very much for the discussion from our online participants. The one thing that we need to take cognizance of is social protection is a developing sector in Africa, and the African Union has taken specific measures to try and see how social protection can be fast-tracked in the respective countries. When you look at our Africa Agenda 2063, social protection is a very key element in that agenda. And secondly, among the East African community, like somebody has said, most of the refugees are from East Africa. There is a policy that is being developed for the East African region, and it gives some certain provisions. So, and we wait for that to be adopted and see how then that will influence our policy and our legislative framework. Like I had earlier said, technology can really help address some of the issues. Because in my thinking, if we made it easy for people to register, then the issue Richard Rory has raised of somebody staying for 30 years without documentation, maybe that will be something that can be a thing of the past. So it is important that we need to look at that. On the issue of the resources of the locals and the refugees, that has always been a very delicate balance. And the pilot at Kalobeye is a good example of trying to see how the host communities and refugees can live together and sustain their natural ecosystem. So I think some of these new interventions that are coming up should be able to give us an indication as to how the host communities and the refugees and the migrants, how can they can coexist together. Back to you, Janet. I think those were basically my question. Now, there was a question on the issue of data sharing. Mm-hmm. And we have had quite a number of issues. Andrew, in the team, we have a bit of data of refugees in our ESR. And for you to be able to access that, if you are in the refugee sector, we have the data sharing protocols that might be signed. Remember, we have a Data Protection Act that protects even data for these refugees. So we have a bit of that data. It's not comprehensive, but it's data that if somebody wanted to access, they can be able to access. Back to you, Janet.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Jane. I think you cued something to what Andrew can speak to. So perhaps, Andrew, we can give you a chance to answer some of the questions we had asked you from Grace and Jacinta. So go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Madam Jane, and thanks again, Jeanette and colleagues, for the good questions. Maybe just to take the very first question that is asking on peace building issues. So yes, we know that there is cultural issues when it comes to refugees and the host community, because these are two different teams who come from different countries and different cultures. And so from UNHCR programming side, there have been a number of conversations with both refugees and host communities around peace building and social cohesion. And what we generally do, we have peace committees, we have peace dialogues, we have peace mediations, and even capacity building of the community members just to ensure that there is peaceful coexistence. But then the question was very broad in terms of what is the role of policy in enhancing that. I know there are a lot of conversations with the county governments that are hosting refugees, actually to ensure that there are policies that are also inclusive of refugees at that level. And this is one thing that would be very much important as much as it would be captured within the national legal framework, but then how do we capture it at the county level so that we handle context-based kind of issues? So it's a conversation that I think for me needs to be moved forward, more so when we're talking about integration and also just ensuring that there is peaceful coexistence for adoption of these different structures that we are saying are long-term, and also just to ensure that they work, because we need community buy-in and community support. So this is something that we can continue, and we will continue engaging the national government and also engaging the county governments. When it comes to data, I'm very pleased to mention that the Ministry of Social Protection Secretariat has taken the process of actually including refugee data into the enhanced single registry. This has happened in some part of the urban population, Mombasa, and is continuing in other areas in the coming times. Then in terms of data sharing, this is an agreement that we have with the Secretariat, that data will be interoperable with our systems, so that with the UNHCR's refugee management systems, so that whatsoever data is coming from there can help us in programming, but can also help the government and other stakeholders in programming, as well as monitoring systems that are within the ESR data management system. So that is well captured, and that would be one of the key areas that we would be advancing with the government to ensure that that data is actually informing programming.
Okay. Andrew, thank you very much for your remark. Shana, if you had heard the question sufficiently, please go ahead and answer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to hand over the question on IDs more to Madam Jane and Andrew, because in the end, you know, it's different in the different countries. And while I know that Richard sits in Kenya, here, of course, this is the status determination, and also especially then the IDs are then done not by UNHCR or ILO, but by the government. So the backlog we're facing with IDs is more from the government side, while in other countries, this is done by UNHCR. And in Kenya, for example, this is not the case. So maybe I can hand this question over to UNHCR. And I know that both the government, DRS, and UNHCR and ILO were all working towards getting this backlog unstuck. So there's a lot of effort and awareness, I would say, at the moment, that this is a huge issue that really makes it much harder for refugees to access social protection schemes and other services. Then on the EAC protocols, yes, so the protocol, for example, the EAC protocol on free movement of persons can be seen or can be a foundation for cross-border cooperation and adapting, for example, common procedures for refugee status determination. It can also help with the whole protocols can help with the coordination of border security, improve regional capacity building, and of course also disaster response. So for example, if one country experiences a disaster, man-made or other, to respond and have, for example, camps set up directly at the borders. I do want to, however, note that the EAC freedom of movement, if people just move across from countries to countries, that is called migration. And if they are in the fear of persecution in their home country and fleeing because of that, only then they become the refugee status, right? And once they are considered a refugee, so let's say Ugandan comes to Kenya because they're living in fear of persecution, then the contract with their country of origin is broken, right? So this person does not, I mean, this person has fled their country. Usually they do not have time or possibility to take their social security benefits with them. So even if bilateral and multilateral agreements are in place, this would not really benefit refugees per se. If a person, however, pays in Ugandan, let's say, pays into the social security system in Kenya, let's say for 20 years, and then it's considered safe for this person to return, they can take then their social protection benefits from Kenya to Uganda if there's a bilateral agreement. But then this person is no longer considered a refugee, but is a returnee. So I just wanted to make that distinction because I hear that quite a lot lately when I interact in the region, that they think, oh, but it's all people from EAC. So, but that also then waters down the definition of a refugee, right? So the definition between refugee and migrant should be separated and is separated via the international law and also via the bilateral and multilateral agreements. Thank you.
I think that's a very critical distinction to make. Thank you for that, Shana. Ezine, I think we'll come to you. Then I saw Andrew had his hand up. We can come back to you briefly as well. Ezine, if you can come on just to answer some of the questions from Peter and Gabrielle that were shared with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Janet. And thanks, Peter and Gabrielle, for those very important questions. So I think from the first bit of how we're tracking progress and sort of otherwise mainstreaming refugees into social protection levels. So we are finding that, for instance, at the country level, we're having integrated social registries, where countries, for instance, like Uganda, are already tracking data on social services offered to both refugees and, and nationals. We're also seeing that at the national policy perspective, you're also having a bit more, embedding. So, for instance, National Development Plan, the MDP4 for Uganda has been developing and already conversations to see how to, how to include, discussions on integrated social services are going on. But also on the census level, I think the last census that was conducted, I think for maybe the first time or maybe not, but really recently, for the first time, the census actually started asking, around service delivery offered to both social protection services offered to both refugees and host communities. And you also see them at district level, where conversations are going on to see, because ultimately, this service delivery, when it comes to social protection services, tends to really happen at the district level. So you're also seeing where, countries like Uganda are trying to mainstream this, even at that very, function, at that very foundational level for districts. And so having this in plans, in constant plans already going on. But now when it comes to also like the tracking of this and the real-time sort of tracking of these efforts, a lot of these plans tend to come with their standard M&E frameworks. But beyond those now, with integrated registries, you're also able to sort of track real-time monitoring of these efforts being going on. Beyond the integrated social registries, you also have the management information systems. So I think earlier I mentioned about like Uganda has, particularly in the refugee space, the URRMS, where sort of tracks all the efforts that is going on in the refugee space, all the services being delivered, social protection services being offered, social assistance being offered, even though that's really for refugees. And also now a lot more effort has to be done now to, like we said, make sure that those real-time data coming from refugee bits are now being fed into national integrated systems. So you have a lot more robust, monitoring and tracking. In addition to that, also you're also having a lot of countries, some countries like Ethiopia begin to mainstream biometrics, biometrics and social protection services. And so doing that as a way to be more efficient, doing that also as a way to reduce duplication of services offered to people, or even duplication of data. And of course, using that also sort of close the loopholes that you may have when where you have multiple people receiving the same person receiving multiple services in a not so efficient manner, right? So some countries like Ethiopia also thinking around this. How do you use biometrics to sort of have real-time tracking that is a lot more quality, a lot more reliable, and a lot more sort of bridges and sort of closes the loopholes that you have in office social protection services. And something that is also going on is also you're also having joint works by both the governments and the donors, where they begin to work together to within the frameworks that already exist. So within these plans where you've already mainstream refugees in social protection, trying to work together to carry out the surveys and the studies to be able to now have a bit more like national holistic data that complements, or you can use to try and relate the information from the integrated registries and also the information from management information systems. So there are also the additional efforts on the research side, trying to generate evidence that complements what already you get on a real-time basis. And I think what you also have with the tracking also is a coordination mechanism. So a lot of these data platforms are also serving like multiple purposes. For instance, in Uganda, the URRMS, beyond the refugee response monitoring system, is also serving as a coordination basis for the government and partners to really understand how much efforts have been done in this space and be able to track those efforts, not real time yet, but is being able to monitor and track those efforts to understand how much progress is going on in social protection in the country and where the gaps still exist. Sort of moving on now to the second question around how I think how the government and international organizations can collaborate to strengthen data collection. So already begin to see linkages to the first question. So first is where we have the clear basis of just interoperable systems. So we have these integrated registries at a national level, but on the MIS level, we tend to have sort of multiple levels. In Uganda right now, we have the URMS, we have a couple of others that exist from partners. And one of the conversations we're having now is how can we help you, both government and international organizations, begin to build interoperable systems, right? So that it's also easy to collect this data, analyze it in one place, but also more importantly, you also sort of save the resources that you spend collecting data across the board. And so that's one of the conversations already going on when you come in Uganda particularly. And these interoperable systems are also now trying to see if they can build in sort of biometric, modules in them of features and even just spatial mapping. And all of these are just ways to get like much more targeted, really good data and to collect that very efficiently and in a very smart way. Then the other thing that also governments and international organizations can do, I think they're already doing, is to harmonize data standards, right? Sort of when it comes to sort of metrics for what results, metrics, for instance, for self-reliance, metrics on migration flows, on needs of refugees, on vulnerabilities, really standardizing that so you have like the same speak, but also you have the same sort of metrics for measurements of results. And I think finally is a very big part of, you don't just collect data, sort of going back to what we were saying earlier, data demand and use for decision making. Within that sphere of decision making, you really want to coordinate your efforts and really make sure that the decisions you're making are made in a coordinated way that use your data to focus on long-term solutions, like when it comes to the needs of refugees and migrants, but also long-term inclusion of refugees and migrants in social protection, national social protection policies and strategies. So I think some of this, like more and more you hear that need for data coordination, data system, data interoperability, and I think these are very critical bits when it comes to how we can track more efficiently, but also when it comes to how governments and international organizations can work a lot more closely when it comes to data management. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Ezine. We will come back shortly for some brief closing remarks from you. I'd like to come back to Andrew. I think you had something that you wanted to add before we also give you a chance to go into your closing remarks. So, Andrew, any additions to the questions that were posed to Shana and Jane? I think Shana alluded to the fact that you would better be able to respond to the more sort of like national, regional policy. So, Andrew, if you're able to speak to that, and then we'll begin to get closing remarks from our panelists. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Janet, and colleagues for great remarks. And I think I just wanted to comment on identification issue. Yes, different identifications that refugees need, either for registration purposes or even for economic purposes, are issued by national systems. And so in the case, for example, of refugee registration identification, we work with the Department of Refugee Services. So I think it's been lauded here more than once on how we could look at innovative systems on how to fast track this process. And I think it's a conversation that will literally need to continue engaging with the government department that is responsible, that is the Department of Refugee Services, on how to support refugees access different identifications that they need, either for their status determination or those that help them in terms of acquiring or accessing different national systems. So this is a process that we are on, and a process that continues, and we hope to see it getting better. Of course, leveraging on different technologies that may exist. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, would you also like to take a moment to give any closing remarks? As you've very well said, I think everyone has spoken comprehensively to the need for partnerships, integration. What would you like to add? Maybe a call to action to the room that we can take with us based on this specific conversation today, very briefly, and then we'll come around to all the other panelists. So Andrew, we'll stay with you and then go around, so you can come back and give us those closing remarks.
Thank you again, and great to give a call to action. From my end, a call to action is recognizing that the refugees in different countries is in that state that it can never be supported by humanitarian services. There is need for solutions, and those solutions for me exist in two things. If we can have national systems supported to include refugees, and also if we can have refugees supported to access social, not social, but rather financial systems or services, so that they are able to open bank accounts, they are able to trade, they are able to contribute to the economy, and then it means refugees will be able to access contributory social protection services, and also the conversation on non-contributory social protection systems will be even more easier. But then a great coordination and collaboration is required in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Great coordination and collaboration is needed for this process. We can come to you, Jane, then Ezine and Shana to give some closing remarks. Jane, anything you'd like to add very briefly, a call to action that you want to leave the room with?
Thank you very much, Janet and colleagues. I think my call to action here is we need to strengthen our coordination systems and structures, so that at the end of the day, we are all able to share the information that we have, and we can be able to make the social protection more vibrant and more feasible, because it's still, we still have quite a bit of work to do. So I'm looking forward to more engagement with the partners in the call, both from government and non-government and UN, for us to be able to make this discussion about refugees and access to social protection a critical part of our programming. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Jane. Indeed, a call for partnerships beyond this webinar is very critical. Ezine, if you can give us any closing remarks beyond what you've already shared, just briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And this has been a very really rich and enlightening conversation. I think on my end, I think one thing I would re-emphasize is when we think around social protection, we've already sort of recognize that we have a weak link of refugees. And I think conversations to begin to sort of lean towards long-term focused solutions that are results-oriented, and long-term solutions that are very sustainable. And with that results-oriented mindset is to really begin to have
Okay, I think Ezine could have frozen on the screen, I believe. If that's the case on everyone's end, perhaps we can...
That conversation on how do we really keep a long-term focus on including refugees in social protection. So I think my call to action would be, to everyone, all of us, we're all in the space together, to just say, in all conversations we have, we should keep very clearly in our mind that national governments need to be supported to do this. And where is the role of innovative approaches in being able to drive that conversation? Where is the role of innovative approaches, innovative financing approaches to drive that long-term focus on solutions that help the government to be more easily integrate refugees into the national social protection systems?
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you for that, Ezine. And finally, Shana, any closing remarks you have just based on the conversation today?
Yes, thank you a lot for the invitation and the great conversation. I think it was very interesting. So I think from my side, the final message or call for action would just be increased government and partner investments in social protection, and especially also health protection, which is sometimes a bit of a separate item, both for nationals and refugees, so that we really see greater investments, systems that work for nationals, systems that then also work hopefully for refugees, moving away from humanitarian thinking sometimes to more development approaches, and generally to see the cross-sectoral approach of like supporting livelihoods, skills, prior recognition of learning, freedom of movement, work permits. All of this really makes a big difference to the refugee population that we're hosting. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Shana, and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for your contributions. To our audience, we still do have one more speaker that we'd love for you to hear from, and that is Gareth O'Hagan, who is a partner at Instiglio. Gareth is partner overseeing Instiglio's work and presence across Africa, as well as its global people, finance, and operations function. So we can hand it over to Gareth, and then I'll come back and just wind us up out of the webinar. Gareth, over to you.
Big thank you. Firstly, Janet, for keeping us on time. Really, really impressive. Thank you so much for that and for your moderation. Thank you to panelists, organizers, and the over 90 attendees for your time, your engagement, and the great questions and discussions. Why is this conversation important? Everyone, including migrants and displaced persons, has a right to a dignified and fulfilling life. And to ensure this, everyone critically also has a right to social security, as we heard, as is emphasized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 22. And while there have been ongoing efforts to improve the quality of social protection, access for refugees in Africa, we've heard today about some of the critical gaps remaining. And in particular, we heard about funding constraints resulting in dependence on aid, constraints within legal and policy frameworks, and also we heard a bit more about technology systems and integration, and a fragmented approach on the implementation side. And just briefly about, in case you haven't heard of Instiglio, I mean, we, CHASP and Instiglio, are partners, very mission aligned, driving and innovating solutions to address these constraints in collaboration with governments in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia in the region, as well as many other partners, including ILO and UNHCR. In Instiglio in particular, a brief overview, we are an advisory and advocacy partner based in Kenya, also Morocco and Colombia. We're a team of development professionals who are mission driven by an urgent imperative to radically enhance development impact, enhancing it through delivering innovative results-based approaches, which you heard Ezine talk about today, and facilitating a global movement to not be complacent about and really, really enhance development effectiveness. And through our partnerships in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, as well as in Latin America, we're enhancing results and cost effectiveness of interventions supporting migrants, displaced people, and host communities. And we hope to be in conversation with many of you separately and to get to know each other better. But getting back to the challenges discussed today, we heard today how addressing the challenges calls for an integrated approach that accounts for the unique needs of migrants and displaced persons. And in three broad categories, as per the structure of the discussion: policy and legal frameworks, the intersection between humanitarian and social assistance, strategic partnerships and collaboration, as well as results-based approaches. And some of the, just sort of noting some of the interesting parts of those discussions, a coherence across refugee, migration, social protection, health, and labor policies. Also, on the implementation side, we can have great policies, but of course we need to be well set up on the implementation side. And we heard a lot about technology and data systems. We heard a lot about partnerships, collaboration, coordination, how important that is, and also about having a real drive towards efficiency and effectiveness using results-based approaches and other methods. And so thanks to all the panelists for that discussion. And on behalf of the panel, I hope I'm capturing most of the calls to action, but I would like to issue a call to action to all of us here today. We all have a duty to, I'm sure, agree on a duty to really move forward on addressing these challenges and bringing forward these solutions. And firstly, is that we advocate for social protection and other national policies and systems which are more inclusive of and accessible to migrants and displaced persons. We strengthen collaborations and coordination across our institutions and also across sectors to ensure solutions which are more integrated and thus genuinely sustainable in terms of the outcomes they can deliver over time. In the face of increasing pressure on domestic and international development funding, let's join together in a drive for greater efficiency and effectiveness in refugee social protection in Africa through, as we've discussed, stronger partnerships and results-based approaches, and looking at longer-term sustainable solutions. In particular, it was great to hear about some of the low-hanging fruit. Change needs momentum, and I would really advocate and call for us to gather around some of those low-hanging fruit and see how together we can see change happening even in the short term, even though some of the solutions, of course, are complex and require longer term and sustained collaboration and focus. Let's continue to work together to create systems that not only protect lives, but also empower displaced persons and communities to thrive. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for those closing remarks, for that call to action as well, all of which I'm sure resonate with all of us here. Much appreciated. Thank you as well to all of the participants who we had in today's webinar. Thank you for your questions, your curiosity and your insights. Thank you to our panelists, our esteemed panel, Ezine, Shana, Jane, and Andrew and Omondi as well. Thank you for just giving us so much rich information on how we can better look into this matter of social protection for immigrants and refugees. And please note that this conversation, the entire recording, is going to be up on CHASP Advisories and Instiglio's social medias. It's going to be shared on the CHASP YouTube. So please look out for that. You can get the whole recording, share it with your friends and networks to really get some of the rich information that came out of it. Keep the conversation going on social media. One last time, those hashtags are social protection, migration, social impact, and funding for impact. And there's going to be a similar series coming up soon, and you have to follow CHASP Advisory Facebook, CHASP Advisory, Instagram, CHASP Advisory _KE, on X, CHASP KE, and LinkedIn, CHASP Advisory. And the same for Instiglio. Facebook, Instiglio, Instagram, Instiglio Inc., X, Instiglio Inc., and LinkedIn, the same. So keep the conversation going. Follow these incredible platforms. Thank you all so much once again for being part of this conversation and for the incredible team behind the scenes as well that kept it going. Thank you, everyone. Please do have a great day ahead. I think, right, Gareth, we understand that you have one or two more things that you would like to say, or are you good? You're good.
I think I'm good. Thanks, Janet.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a fantastic day ahead, and please keep following the conversation. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.